pretty poor Latin. Write it out 100 times, this time correctly. This scene popped into my head when I was considering how this figure, with its closest parallels in the Roman frontier system and hinterland of Hadrian's Wall, might have arrived in a cave at East Wemyss. Who actually put it there and when, and what did it mean to its makers and to the local population, who of course might have been the same people. And whether by looking at using it as a case study really, and looking closely at the archaeology of its surroundings and the historical record, see if we can shed a little more light on some of those interactions between the inhabitants of the area and the Roman Empire that were taking place in the early part of the first millennium. Now, I am not an trained archaeologist or historian, and certainly no sort of authority on Roman Britain. So what I'm really hoping to do here is invite those of you who are to take a closer look at this site and see what conclusions from the archaeological and historical evidence may be supportable. Those of you attending the Pictish Arts Society field trip later in the year will of course have the chance to do just that. The identification of this carving as Romano-British is not new. That idea has been around since at least 2016, and Kelly Kilpatrick, Helen Mackay and myself have all written or talked about why we can be fairly sure that this is a representation of the Romano-British god Cacidius. To establish the basis for that identification, I'll start by outlining what we do know about this carving and its context. I should say here that I won't be talking about these guys. The Pictish spearmen, with whom I'm sure you're all very familiar, which shows a similar figure to Wemyss but in a different stance. These have been written about elsewhere and also ascribed to Romano-British influence and an early date. So there's obviously a lot in common with the figure at Wemyss, as will become clear, but it's specifically that Wemyss figure that I want to concentrate on. The black and white photo is of Court Cave at East Wemyss, as it was before the collapse of the roof in the 1970s above that middle pillar of the three. There's an entrance to the main chamber of Court Cave just to the right of the picture behind the right hand pillar, and to the left was a roofed space which had another entrance leading into the main chamber, which is hidden here behind the left pillar. In that main chamber there is a panel of Pictish carvings, and off to the left of this initial space is the passageway where the Cacidius carving can be found. This is a laser scan of the complex undertaken in 2016 for the Wemyss Caves 4D project, and you can see the main chamber of Court Cave at the top with the passageway picked out at the bottom there in red. The first account of the carving was published in 1866 by James Young Simpson, who had visited the area 2 years previously to investigate reports of cup marks. Now, there are cup marks in this passageway. I won't consider them here. Whether or not they're authentically Bronze Age or perhaps related to later Christian activity is a matter for debate. But in a subsequent visit that year, Simpson recorded this human figure. The first real description we have of the passageway is from a local man called John Patrick, and he tells us that it wasn't originally a passageway at all, but was turned into one just before 1850 when a gas pipe was put through. Although he didn't write this until 1903, he was by then 72 years old and had known the caves all his life. He's a very reliable observer. He was born in the next village of Buckhaven and later had a photographic studio in East Wemyss in the 1860s. So he very likely witnessed this himself as a teenager. The gasworks opened in 1846, so we can be fairly certain that prior to this date, what we now experience as a tunnel was actually a narrow enclosed cave. This is the rear of the passage, and you can see the square cut made by the Victorian engineers, who tunnelled through about 2 metres or so from the back of the cave to bring the passageway out on the side of the village of East Wemyss. There's no evidence of any other shaping or widening of the original cave. So this is a closer view of the laser scan. I've marked on it the original end of the cave, the position of the carving, and of the cut marks that Simpson originally came to see. That original chamber would have been around 13 metres long and is between 1.5 and 3 metres wide at different points. And as I'm sure your eyes are beginning to pick out, there are also several other features along the walls. And in fact, I think we have at least this many features in there. There are at least 5 stone seats carved into the walls, and adjacent to the figure is a large recess. There are also 2 shallow scoops made into the wall at ground level on each side of the threshold at the entrance to the cave, and a possible shelf at the back. I'll start with the easiest to see, which is the large recess right next to the carving. It measures 1.2 metres high, 0.6 metres wide and half a metre deep, and it's completely unremarked upon by any of the antiquarians or archaeologists that have visited the site. It has a hole cut through the rock, which is known as a hold first, so that's the hole in the bottom left hand corner which comes out within the recess itself, and there are several other of those both in this passageway and in other caves, and they appear in caves with and without carvings. Their purpose is completely unknown and completely unrecorded, and in fact they were unknown to Simpson, who did remark upon them back in the 1860s. So we know that they weren't in use then and had probably gone out of use a long time before, because there was no local memory of what their purpose might have been. They're generally made along the edge of natural horizontal or vertical surfaces as the easiest place to put them, but in this passage they utilise the artificial features, so this one in the corner of the recess and others on the edge of the bench seats. So that would probably date the features of the recess to well before the mid-19th century, although that's as much as we can really say about them. The recess itself also has no attested historical use, although a hearth or storage space has been suggested for it. Beyond the recess, further along the wall to the left, you can see the series of benches. And hopefully you can see them more clearly in this picture. There are 3 seats visible here, one just to the left of the picture, the larger one in the middle, and one just to the right of that. And you can see how the rock has been cut and smoothed to create both the seat of the bench and also a back which slightly recesses it into the cave wall. We do have a single antiquarian reference to these, and this again comes from Simpson, although he comments on just a single bench in this passage. Apart from that, nobody has ever considered what these are and why they might be here, and they are actually quite difficult to see from within the cave. A casual observer on a quick visit, which Simpson himself admits they didn't spend very long in the caves, you wouldn't necessarily notice them. The final feature is what appear to be 2 shallow scoops either side of the entrance. You can see them on either side of this picture. It's much less clear that these are archaeological in nature, and I'm quite prepared to accept that natural geological formations might have caused these, but given their position at the entrance to this cave, I think they're probably worth some further investigation. But I don't think there's any doubt at all about the artificial nature of the other features that I've been talking about. This is a 3D model of the cave. It's a photogrammetry model made by taking hundreds of photographs from which the 3-dimensional surfaces are calculated, and this is actually looking at the cave from the outside, as if we're standing behind the wall of the cave. I find you can quite often visualize things much more clearly than you can from looking at the interior, and with this model I've also colorized it in a way that enhances vertical and horizontal and smooth surfaces, and you can quite clearly see the large recess. That you might just be able to make out the little figure of Cocydius above it and to to the right, and you can very clearly see a series of benches excavated into the walls and a shelf at the back. So these features are clearly real and show that somebody spent a lot of time and effort to create them. So the question is, what date are they? Are they contemporary with the carving? And this is where everything gets very, very difficult, because the chamber has never been excavated. The mid-19th century works means that it's very unlikely any intact floor layers survive, and I'm not expecting that there's any real datable archaeology that we're going to be able to get any scientific dating from out of here. The adjacent main chamber of Court Cave has often been used for large assemblies. It's the very name comes from the medieval court assemblies. It's been used for boat repairs. It's been used as a miner's restroom, and what is now this passageway could have seen service for a variety of reasons. In fact, the only feature that we can plausibly date is the carving itself, and I'll come on to the evidence for that shortly. So I would probably have left it there were it not for... I'll talk about that site shortly, but first, how do we know this is who the carving represents?
Are you there, Mike?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's gone on here at all. The PowerPoint presentation's stuck. I'm trying to resurrect it. Hang on.
Okay.
I'll talk about... Yeah, apologies about this. I might have to switch to the video version. PowerPoint's throwing all sorts of problems. I'll be back with you in very brief order.
Okay.
Firstly, I think I need to explain and to see
where were we?
The hearth in Hideous deity can't be certain. They can also be accompanied by an...
Hang on a minute. There we go.
God at the entrance.
Apologies for that.
I'll talk about that site shortly.
Sorry.
It's very, very difficult because the chamber's restroom and what is now this passageway could have seen service for a variety of reasons. In fact, the only feature that we can plausibly date is the carving itself, and I'll come on to the evidence for that shortly. So I would probably have left it there were it not for an intriguing site across the Forth in Northumbria, which consists of an enclosed natural rock space with an artificial bench and a carving of what is very possibly the same war god at the entrance. I'll talk about that site shortly, but first, how do we know this is who the carving represents? Let's have a quick look at how it's been recorded over the years, recorded with varying degrees of artistic skill, I think you'll agree. After Simpson first recorded it, it was illustrated but not discussed in John Stewart's Sculptured Stones of Scotland, and although a rubbing was taken by John Romilly Allen in 1890, he doesn't mention it in his 1903 Early Christian Monuments of Scotland. In 1893 it was photographed by John Patrick, and it's his later commentary that led to its subsequent characterisation as Thor and his goat, a name by which it's still known locally. This is Patrick's original passage, which identifies the figure as Thor, an identification which lasted for over 100 years. Here it is again, also repeated by George Dees in 1948. Frustratingly, neither Patrick nor Dees give any references for the specific figures they mention, so we can't really make a modern reassessment based on that. There are petroglyph figures with arms outstretched in both Norway and Sweden, dated to the Bronze Age. The closest that I can find are these from Brastad, I think that's how it's pronounced, in Sweden. To the right of the human figure at Wemyss is what both Patrick and Dees saw as the Triskele symbol of Odin. In the picture at the bottom on the left hand side is an actual 9th century carving of one of these, which is actually 3 drinking horns. I really struggled to see that in the Wemyss figure. I think it's much more likely that it's an animal, and which may even be reflected in its local name of Thor and his goat. And I think we can be fairly certain that the Scandinavian origin is anachronistic. So why do we say that the Wemyss figure is Cacidius? Let's have a look at the surviving dedications and inscriptions. The Cacidius depictions in the hinterland of Hadrian's wall are either carved in relief or inscribed on monumental stone. They can be on open rock face or on portable metalworking. They vary quite a lot. Some of them are just a dedication, some of them are a dedication and an image, and some of them are just an image. All the recognised or possible depictions have at least 3 of the following 5 characteristics. They have their legs apart, they have their arms outstretched, they have a spear in their right hand, quite often with a bulb at the bottom of it. They have a shield in their left, and they can also be accompanied by an animal. Most of the spears have this distinctive knob-shaped butt. Patrick actually observed this, noted it, but misinterpreted at Wemyss. They're attested to by Cassius Dio in the early 3rd century, and they may have been ceremonial rather than military weapons. They're reported as making a noise when shaken. With the exception of a definite shield, the figure at Wemyss has all of these characteristics. And I think you can actually argue that there might be a shield at the end of that outstretched arm on the left. It's quite an unnatural position to have a break in your elbow, or you have to work quite hard to bend your wrist like that. So there's a slight chance that actually does represent a shield, I think. But all these similarities argue very, very strongly that Wemyss belongs in this tradition along Hadrian's Wall. What we know of Cacidius, that he was a complex and multifaceted god. He was adopted into the Roman pantheon as both Cacidius Mars and Cacidius Silvanus, after the gods of war and hunting respectively. The animal at Wemyss alongside the human figure may be a representation of the Silvanus aspect. A case has been made that Cacidius is a god quite local to the frontier, and there are also other native deities who are sometimes represented very similarly to Cacidius that were venerated within the Roman pantheon. To the west of the wall, these include Bellaticadros, who's very similar to Cacidius. That's quite possibly him in the bottom left-hand corner, but he has the addition of small horns. It's been argued by Anne Ross that it, quote, is always in question whether 2 separate deities are invoked, or whether, in accordance with Celtic custom, the same deity is venerated under 2 or more names. So it's possible that the Wemyss carving is an unknown local version of a wider god, or a different aspect of the same god. These things aren't really necessarily that clear cut. So a directed identification of the specific deity can't be certain, and we know that Cacidius could and did travel. There's a dedication to him from Lancaster, well to the south of the wall, dedicated to Mars Cacidius and raised by a former military officer on the governor's staff. So we know that if he was originally local, he could travel. What we know about the distribution of the artifacts and the carvings is that they very strongly represent a military presence. The person who's done the most comprehensive study of Cacidius is Kenneth Fairless, and he concluded that the evidence as it survives points to the military overwhelmingly as the worshippers of Cacidius. And these are drawn from both legionary troops and auxiliary forces. They range from ordinary soldiers to regimental commanders. So where did they worship? The possible shrines to the war god are extremely rare, but in addition to the carvings, the inscriptions and portable objects, there is written and archaeological evidence of 2 possible shrines to Cacidius associated with the Hadrian's Wall frontier. One is at Bewcastle Fort in Cumbria, where a pair of silver Cacidius plaques, that's one of them in the middle at the bottom of the picture, these silver Cocydius plaques were found, and up to a further 7 inscriptions. So it seems to have been a focus, and there's a Phantom Cocidi appears in the Ravenna cosmography, which may actually mean that this is the cult centre of the worship of Cocydius. Much more significant remains are at South Yard Hope in Northumbria, which was identified as a Romano-British shrine to Cocydius following excavations in 1983 by Charlton and Mitchison. This shrine is formed from a natural chamber which is about 4 meters square internally, and it has a bench carved from the rock along one side. There's also a narrow carved shelf and also a groove which is thought to have actually served as a roof, so it would have been an enclosed space, although primarily made out of natural rock formations. There's a hearth in the southeast corner, and immediately outside the entrance is a relief carving of Cocydius. So although the additional features in the chamber at Wemyss are entirely unexcavated and undated, I think there are some striking similarities here between what we have in the Court Cave passage at Wemyss and what we have at Yard Hope. Both are enclosed natural rock chambers. They have a depiction of the same figure. They contain benches and shelves. And so I think we really need to seriously consider the possibility that the chamber of Wemyss is important not only because it contains a Romano-British carving, but might actually be an extremely rare, if not unique, example of a Romano-British influenced cult site in Scotland. In the case of Yard Hope, it's been argued that it may well be that the native Celts regarded it as the cave shrine as a sacred place long before the Roman invasion, and that Cocydius may have been introduced into that space, or it was already a site of his veneration. If we look at the whole history of the Wemyss caves as a focus for ritual, symbolic, devotional activity since the Bronze Age, that's through things like an undisputed cup and ring mark from Michael Cave, the Pictish symbols, early Christian crosses, early medieval burials, and even the Hansel Monday celebrations of the 19th century, which were Christian celebrations. I think those attest to their ancient and enduring importance as a site of veneration. And the co-option of part of this site for the worship of Cocydius in the early first millennium would be entirely in keeping with the history of what we know about the site. So if it is Cocydius, and if it is directly comparable to the Hadrian's wall examples, and if we may have an example of an actual shrine, who might have made it and when did they do it? So I think there's 3 possible answers to the question of who did it. The first is direct Roman military presence, actual Romans here on this site. The second is that it was people who were intimately familiar with the frontier system but weren't necessarily in the service of Rome at the time that they made it. And the third is that it was an independent local initiative without any direct Roman involvement, but a result of broader cultural contact between the areas north and south of the Forth. So let's take those in order. I've marked South Yard Hope on this map. It's a big blue star, and it's around 10 kilometres from the fort at High Rochester and close by to another fort at Risingham. The other dedications to Cocydius, as we've seen, suggest they're very closely associated with military frontier forts, and Fairless argues that they're not made by soldiers on campaign, but actually a more stable, the product of more stable long-term postings. So this would imply that if the Wemyss figure was made by forces in the service of Rome, then it was carved at a time when it was within easy reach of Roman forts and regularly visited in an area regarded as relatively secure. If the benches are contemporary, then it would have had capacity for 10 or more seated devotees. We haven't actually tried that out yet, but are going to see how many people can actually sit in there. But it implies a group of followers rather than a single individual. So I'm going to do now a brief history of the Romans in Fife and offer some possible contexts for when these sorts of conditions may have prevailed. The initial organised Roman presence, of course, was in the 1st century AD. Agricola reached Fife and went beyond Fife within 30 years of the AD 43 landings in southern England. And once Hadrian's Wall had been constructed, East Wemyss was never more than 90 miles from the former Roman frontiers. East Wemyss is marked with another blue star on this map. Now, there's no archaeological evidence of Roman military activity in Fife dating to the 1st century, and the distribution of forts along the Gask Ridge to the north and west, which you can see at the top of the map here, were constructed in around 70 to 80 AD and abandoned after possibly only 10 years service. What this implies is that Fife was regarded possibly at this time as an untroublesome territory behind the advancing frontier. Whether that apparent acquiescence was a resented but pragmatic decision, there's nothing you can do to fight the Romans on your doorstep, or actually involved any degree of enthusiasm for the Roman project by at least a section of the local rulers, is really unknowable. But it sets a pattern for all the subsequent Roman interventions into this part of the world. Fife was again seemingly incorporated back within the reach of empire with the construction of the Antonine Wall around 140 AD. North of Fife, you can see some evidence of some of the Gask Ridge forts showing Antonine activity, and a major naval fort was established at Cramond, just 15 miles across the Forth from East Wemyss. And at Cramond there is, of course, the significant eagle carving on the bare rock just outside where the naval base would have been. To the southeast of Cramond, and also within 15 miles of East Wemyss by sea, was the key forward supply base at Inveresk, and it's been argued that that was actually the seat of governance for the whole Antonine wall system. It also happens to be home to the only known Mithraeum in Scotland, which has been confidently dated to the Antonine occupation. Now, Mithraic temples are also closely tied to the Roman military frontier, of course, and I would just like to throw out there, I'm not going to spend any time on this, but could it be considered that the shrine at East Wemyss, if that's what it is, has actually borrowed architectural inspiration from such structures? And Mithraeum is, after all, built to reproduce a cave, and would it be so surprising to see an actual cave borrowing some of those sorts of architectural ideas in its use? The Antonine garrison north of Hadrian's Wall at this time has been estimated at approximately 20,000, and Roman Scotland at the time was one of the most intensely policed regions of the empire. This intensive military presence around Fife for a period of 20 to 40 years, which lasted until the withdrawal back to Hadrian's Wall in the early 160s and completed in the mid 180s. This extensive and seemingly permanent at the time occupation would, I think, have provided good conditions to encourage the transfer of Roman military cult activity from the Hadrian annex to the Antonine frontier, and would have provided the soldiers who could invest in the necessary labour to produce the carving, make repeat visits, and, if they're contemporary, carry out those modifications to the chamber. There is, however, a problem with the date. The previously recognised Cocidius dedications and images have been ascribed mostly to the 3rd century AD, whilst allowing for a 2nd century origin. Now, these dates from Charlton and Mitchison derive from Fairless's 1966 MA thesis, which I've been unable to get a look at, and even if I could, I'm in no position to assess, comment on the probability and style that's referred to here. But as far as I can tell, these dates have never been refined or re-evaluated in the 60 years since. So I think it would be interesting to see what resulted from that, with what's been learnt about activity along the Hadrianic frontier over the last 60 years or so. But as things stand, an Antonine date does seem a bit early. Following the withdrawal from the Antonine Wall, imperial policy towards the area seems to have shifted away from direct military intervention and towards what's now known as silver diplomacy. So there's at least 40 hoards of silver coins known from Scotland between 140 and 230 AD, and they're showing initial concentration to the north and west of Fife before being concentrated further south, but there are some from Fife. And Fraser Hunter summarised the evidence for these and other Roman artefacts in Fife, and arguing that this did indeed show that there had been a new Roman policy of appeasement or bribery and buying peaceful neighbours, which broke down at the end of the 2nd century and ended with the Severan campaign from about 208 to 11 AD. And the forts from that campaign are shown here on the map. So this silver silver was to return, but this initial burst of silver diplomacy gave way again to military intervention with Severus. We know that there had been unrest begun under the reign of Commodus some 20 years or so, 25 years or so before, and an expeditionary force to the north is claimed to have inflicted major defeats on the barbarians, but they still needed large amounts of silver to keep the peace until finally Severus came north with an absolutely massive force, estimated at about 40,000 troops. And Roman historians had no shame in describing this as a genocidal war against what they called the Maetae, Caledonii and other Picts. And there's a series of marching camps that you can see for the first and only time within Fife. These are actually unexcavated and have been ascribed to this period on their form and size. So it's not absolutely certain they're Severan, but that seems to be the convention. They also built a new legionary fortress of Campbell-Howes just on the Tay, just slightly outside what is now Fife, and again only 15 miles northwest overland from Wemyss. And although Severus died before the campaign could be completed, his intention had been to subjugate the whole of Scotland, and from what we know of the campaign, Fife was again quickly left behind the front line. So the size of the Roman force, the pacification of Fife earlier in the campaign, are all favourable really, as is the date towards the possibility that this is when the carving dates from. Obviously, although the numbers of troops was actually greater than during the Antonine period, it was much less permanent, although, you know, in Severus's own words, it had been intended to be permanent. So it's a possibility. It doesn't really fit what we know about Cocydius' descriptions as being tied to a frontier system rather than linked to field armies, would tend to argue against it though. But I think it's certainly a possibility to be entertained that this is the period that it dates from. Following the death of Severus and the withdrawal from Scotland under his son Caracalla, frontier policy seems to have changed back to the silver diplomacy, and there's a renewed influx of silver into Scotland and Fife in particular. This is the Desy hoard, which dates to the late 3rd century and comprises Roman silver, and this discovery really further cemented Fife within these Roman imperial policy shifts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There seems to have been, whatever the settlement was between the Romans and local forces following the Severan withdrawal, there seems to be no really further serious Roman military intervention for the best part of 100 years. By the end of the 3rd century, that settlement had broken down, and in 306 AD, responding to attacks across Hadrian's Wall by the Picts, who are named for the first time during his rule, Constantius Chlorus reoccupied Campbell-Howes, and in a very short-lived campaign, seemingly modelled in terms of its route on that of Severus a century earlier. This campaign was proclaimed a victory, but it ended when Chlorus died a few months later. And so, although it would perhaps fit better with the dating evidence, the short-lived nature of the campaign means it can probably be disregarded as a possible origin. Romans were back later. the exploratores and the Ariani, who were sort of Roman special forces operating beyond the frontier, deep into enemy territory. We're told carried out operations specifically in the Scottish borders, Fife and the Upper Midland Valley. So the Romans were still here, but not in any great organised force, and certainly not on anything like the scale that we saw in the Antonine and Severan occupations. I want to turn very briefly now to the second group of people I identified who may have been responsible for the carving, and that's people intimately familiar with the frontier system but not necessarily in the service of Rome. And the lack of recorded hostilities in this long 3rd century doesn't mean that the Roman army, and certainly not its agents, doesn't mean they were absent north of the Forth. Little has actually been written about the diplomatic and logistical mechanisms through which the silver arrived, even whether it was delivered to the north or collected in the south, but it would have involved numbers on both sides in close contact with each other in a time of relatively stable relations and with opportunity for cross-cultural influences. I've already mentioned the exploratores, thought to have been largely drawn from local troops, although very much part of the Roman army, who would operate during conflict as advanced scouts and raiders. But in peace times they would play a slightly different role. So you've got this group of people with a foot in both camps, if you like, and it's not impossible to imagine that such groups might take employment from and live in both societies at different times. We know of Pictish mercenaries, for example, serving in the Roman army, hostages taken by the Roman forces, other groups as well. So there were people that would have been very familiar with the sort of architecture and the devotional practices along Hadrian's Wall. So as I say, I think this is the least likely of the sources by which it arrived, but it should still be considered that though it's still clearly from a Romano-British tradition, the people who made it were no longer actually in the service of Rome, but were perhaps retained by a local leader seeking advantage amongst what we know as a very highly competitive warrior elite, and bringing in the idea of bringing these people in, and with them bringing in some of their practices that had been acquired in the course of their contact with Rome. And the final group I want to turn to, or the final idea I want to turn to, is that the carving arrived here through a more general process of cultural exchange. So connections with Rome clearly gave local prestige, and whilst the imported silver was highly valued and enabled local elites to cement loyalties, other Roman goods were also clearly important. This is Constantine's Cave in Fife, and from here and nearby Kinkell Cave in 1913, a collection of Roman material was discovered. This is about 20 miles east from East Wemyss along the Forth coast. So Samian and courseware, a bronze jug handle, large fragments of amphorae, and a section of a glass bottle, although sadly almost all of those are now lost. A pottery stamp on a handle from one of the amphora, a Dressel 20 amphora from Constantine's Cave, has been dated to the mid-2nd century, although date of manufacture could of course long preceded the date of deposition. And although these such vessels, Dressel 20s, are closely connected with the imperial supply of olive oil to the military, and they predominate in the frontiers regions of Britain, they're not necessarily direct evidence of direct Roman military presence, because they're also well known from other Scottish sites. And of course we have a lot of examples, which I don't have time to go into here, about other Roman materials that have been found in caves around Scotland from this period. So it's been argued that it's more useful to see this sort of rich Roman material in caves. I say rich in a Scottish context, not necessarily rich in terms of what you would find elsewhere in Britain. But this Roman material, to see it as offerings, with exotic and powerful offerings being used in local rituals. And if we see the material artifacts in that way, then it raises the possibility that we can also see the ideas in that way. So the introduction of Roman materials into a well-established sacred space, could we also be seeing the introduction of Romanized practices, as i.e. a new way to venerate deities, and it's just this idea that's being imported rather than the direct physical presence of the Romans. Now, Alex Wolff, for example, drawing on work by James Fraser, has argued that we actually know very little about the extent of the cultural, linguistic and religious similarities and differences between societies on each side of the Forth during and after the Roman period. And indeed, we don't know what the term Picts actually originally meant. For Gildas, writing in the late 5th century, the term Picts pretty much meant anybody north of Hadrian's Wall and not necessarily those north of the Forth. So we don't know exactly what the relationship is between people north and south of the Forth. And the term Pict originally seems to just distinguish the barbarous peoples further north from the somewhat compliant provincials. And that definition of what a Pict was may have been fluid as the frontier ebbed and flowed, and for long periods could have just referred to everyone north of the wall. It's also been argued by Guy Halsall and others that there was a southern Pictish confederacy, or sort of early proto-Pictish confederacy, if you like, the Caledonies, who appear in the writings of Ammianus Marcellinus, and that this originally stretched as far as the wall and persisted right up until the mid-5th century, when earlier tribal identities were reasserted. And so this would have included those areas of Northumbria and Cumbria from where most of the evidence for Cocydius comes. And of course, although most of the evidence for Cocydius comes directly from the Roman military, not all carvings are in relief and not all are well executed. And it's been suggested that some of the incised figures owe much more to indigenous Iron Age art and were made by the local population, albeit under Romanized influence. And we shouldn't forget either that Cocydius and similar war gods were venerated in northern Britain long before the Romans arrived, and there's no reason to doubt that continued. So it can't be excluded that the idea of carving at Wemyss arrived through this broader contact and was a product of diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, and not directly with the Romans, but with the non-Roman population living close to the wall, who'd begun to depict their gods in stone under Roman influence. Now, if the carving wasn't made by Roman soldiers in active service, but originated locally, this might actually dramatically change our perception of it. Rather than being a symbol of occupation or cultural Romanization, if it was, for example, carved under local initiative in the second half of the 3rd century, as the silver dried up and raids on Roman Britain increased, it would actually become a symbol of defiance and hostility. And invoking a war god, albeit one in a Romano-British style, may be something that's most appropriate in times of war, which sort of brings us back to the title at the beginning, that what exactly are they writing here, what exactly they're trying to say here when they put the carving. So we've seen that the dates for the Cocydius carvings along Hadrian's Wall are ascribed to the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD. I want to turn now and look at the dating evidence from Wemyss and see how that matches up. The radiocarbon dates we have from Wemyss come from the undisturbed interior of Sliding Cave, and this is from excavations, the most recent excavations undertaken by Gordon Noble in 2019. There are a number of small surviving Pictish carvings, including a double disc symbol, and the radiocarbon dates show a initial activity and the most intensive activity from between the dates of about 550 to 400 AD, so fitting right in that same time frame as the Cocydius carvings. These dates obtained by Gordon confirm those from Wessex archaeology under the Time Team excavations, which have been obtained 15 years previously. There are other close stylistic parallels to the inscribed unembellished outline carvings in the court cave at Wemyss, and we have radiocarbon dates for 2 of those. One set is the slabs from Dunnicare in Aberdeenshire, again excavated by Gordon Noble, and the other is from the Sculptor's Cave in Murray. And this is how the radiocarbon dates line up, all within that broad 2nd to 4th century range, although the activity of the sliding cave at Wemyss is slightly earlier. So there's a picture beginning to emerge of important activities in caves, and I haven't got time to rehearse this. There's a lot been written, particularly in light of the excavations in Sculptor's Cave. But in these caves and coastal sites in that same 2nd to 4th century time frame as the frontier Cocidius carvings were being made. And the sites that display this activity also display simple incised Pictish symbols. When exactly in that time frame those symbols began, we can't say, but it's surely earlier than has long been thought. Leslie Alcock, long before he had any radiocarbon dates to go on and confirm his ideas, argued that these symbols in places like Wemyss could be seen as ancestral to the monumental carving, and I think he's right about that. I also think that the long established idea that the practice of carving these symbols in stone results in the first place from contact with Rome is correct. So at Wemyss, with the close proximity of the Cocidius carvings to Pictish symbols and the overlap of the dates, do we have direct evidence of that interaction in a way that we don't have anywhere else? This is just how close the Cocidius figure and the Pictish symbols are. They're about 20 metres apart within the same larger complex, but whereas the Cocidius carving is in a narrow cave, poorly lit, the Pictish symbols are on what would have been the most brightly lit wall in the cave, and in a very large space that we know over the years has been used for communal gatherings. So clearly very different in purpose and audience from each other, but with the same intention to communicate through expressing identity by carving in stone. And the idea that one directly inspired the other within a fairly close time frame is not, I think, on the balance of the evidence, entirely unreasonable. Now, saying that doesn't mean that I'm following the example of the 5 antiquarians who saw Romans everywhere. That view of the people north of the Forth in the first millennium as culturally passive until the Romans and then the Scandinavians turned up is disproven by what the Picts themselves went on to do with their carving tradition and their development of a society which was a serious player in early medieval Britain. But I do think that maybe we have a seed at Wemyss, a seed planted in conditions of military and wider cultural contact with the Roman world, and one which took root and flourished as those early kingdoms and ultimately Pictland emerged. Whether the evidence supports what I'm suggesting is for people like the good folk of the Pictish Art Society and denizens of academic halls to assess. And I'm highly conscious that as the chair of the Save Wemyss Ancient Cave Society, I may be thought to have a vested interest in talking up the site. I'll finish with this image. A couple of years ago, a combination of grants from Historic Environment Scotland, Fife Environmental Trust, crowdfunding and donations, including one from the Pictish Art Society, allowed us to install protective gates at the site which will help protect what's here for generations to come. And rather than just put in sort of crude prison bars, we wanted to reflect the heritage on the site. And there was only really one choice for this passageway. So here he is, the war god venerated here nearly 2,000 years ago, standing guard over his own little patch of Fife. Thanks.
Right. Right. Can you hear me, Mike?
I can, yes.
Well, thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk and a wonderful introduction to what we're going to see. And I think what's so thrilling is that you get to the feeling that you really are at the beginning of the Pictish identity in that area, and how it is just a tipping point of connection between the Romans and the Picts suddenly realizing who they were as something special. But could I just ask you a cheeky question? It's a very nice gate. Who made that? Who designed it?
I can't remember their name. It was a local fabricators, so they're from Kirkcaldy.
Oh, right.
The architect, I mean, this is terrible, but I can't remember his name either. Heritage architect came up with this idea of twisting the metal. Originally, we wanted to sort of like put cast figures on it, which would probably have been ripped off and disappeared in short order. So doing this technique, I think, is extremely effective. It looks better the further away you are, but I think it works really well, as you'll see, particularly the one on Jonathan's cave.
Well, it's lovely. It's really very subtle and witty as well. Very clever
Yeah,
take.
I've actually met people who come down just to look at the gates.
Well, I would. So can we open this up to questions from the floor? We look at the Graham Purvis says, Cocydius features quite prominently in The Ghosts of the Forests, 2022, William Young's exploration of the mythology of post-Roman Teutonic kingdoms lying in the north of Hadrian's Wall. Young suggests that he even migrated into Arthurian romance and pops up again as the Brown Man or Brownie in Border Tales by John Leyden and James Hogg. And Sue Hampstead, it's Leg Steel Kirkcaldy who constructed the grills. Thank you very much. Blacksmiths are always undersung, and it's great to be able to know his name. Leg Steel. Thank you. So, any more questions? I'm not quite sure how the raised hand function works. I don't know if you can look at that, Fiona.
Yes, I don't think we've got any raised hands, but if anybody has a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat.
And what we wanted to remind people was that if the question doesn't come to you now, you can have a chance to talk to Mike later on if you get on the field trip.
Okay, so we've got a question from John Ralph in the chat. So there's evidence of Roman artifacts at East Lomond. Is there any connection with East Wemyss?
Personally, I think there must be. When you're down at East Wemyss, the prominent hill that you see not so far away is East Lomond, just when you get back up above the caves. I've been involved in all those excavations over the years at East Lomond. I didn't want to mention it because I can't find publication of it anywhere, but there was actually a square building suggested for one of the excavations at East Lomond, which would be intriguing if that were followed through to see where that might have come from. But yes, I think that the dates from East Lomond show that was also somewhere that was being used possibly intermittently, possibly continually, right throughout this period. So I think as one of the sort of power bases of the emerging societies, you're likely to see the same sorts of things happen. But I think there's something quite specific about the caves. There's something quite specific about what people are doing in caves in the first few centuries AD, which is very different to the sort of inland sites that you find.
Fantastic. And Graham, you've got a question?
Yeah, thank you. Mike, there's been, as you know, a long discussion regarding the symbols at the Wemyss site. None of them reach the standard of even the most basic class 1 symbols on standing stones. So the question was, are these rather poorly executed prototypes before the sculptors had mastered the technique of carving on stones, or do they represent a degenerative form? And I think you've roundly answered that question now with the dating evidence in particular, that these are earlier than the full flowering of Pictish art and not a degenerative form. Would I be right in thinking that?
Yeah, that's certainly what I think, yeah. It's not just on the sort of crudeness, if you like, of the carvings, which doesn't necessarily mean it's an early day, but they're certainly unembellished. They don't have anything, any of the decorations that you get elsewhere. But it's also what you might term the grammar of them. So there's a lot been said about the specific arrangements of symbols and pairing of them on the monumental stones. You simply don't have that at Wemyss. It's much more random, much more, or seemingly random. We don't know that it is random. I think Hugh Levy's has done some work on that, on looking at the distribution of the symbols. I think it suggests that they are early, and that before it becomes an actual school of carving, before it becomes a particular way in which you do these things, somewhere like Wemyss, right on the forefront of that cultural interaction, is where, if you like, that experimentation takes place. I don't think they're sort of folk carvings, as has been suggested, in that this is just ordinary people going about carving. I think this is under somebody's control, somebody quite important who's in charge of this site. But the style is certainly very different. And this is what Leslie Alcock was arguing, that yes, places like this are early and ancestral to the more organized monumental stones. And I suppose what I've just tried to argue in the talk is perhaps we can see another ancestor in this sequence in the Cocidius carving, that the actual idea of carving comes directly from the Roman world. And of course, what they go on to carve is their own cultural identity, their own cultural expression, and very much becomes something that is distinctively Pictish. And so that's why I sort of see it as a seed. The idea of carving is what comes from the Roman world. And I didn't give an answer about when I thought the Cocidius carving was made, because honestly, I don't know. I think there's too much uncertainty about the evidence, too much conflicting between the dates and so, but really all road leads, wherever it comes from, whether it's through direct Roman contact or mediated contact or wider cultural influence, ultimately all roads do lead to Rome. And I think Wemyss shows that.
And in terms of the symbol placement, I quite agree with you. It's much more evident on stones that there is this sort of grammar or syntax in operation on the Class 1 stones, certainly, that one doesn't see in the Wemyss caves. But what one does see is quite a common field of artistic source material. Things like the double disc, sometimes with a Z rod, I think. You've got the rather stylized version of the mirror case symbol. And of course, there are some quite cute representations of the dolphin ? Symbol. So whoever was carving at Wemyss was clearly tapping into the same source as the carvers of the field monuments a little later. So that tends to push back the meaning and indeed the partial stylization of some of the symbols that we refer to as Pictish, but I think you used the phrase they are proto-Pictish. We're not into the historical period of the Picts quite yet. So that really gives an even greater historical perspective to the development of what we all recognize as Pictish symbols.
Yeah, I think that clearly, I don't really want to get into this whole idea about where the Pictish symbols came from, but I think perhaps one of the conclusions that you can draw from this is actually they already had these symbols and were using them on perishable goods, on body art, whatever. And you can discuss the evidence for that. And it's the stone carving that is new, and that these are actually quite widespread, even before the carving took place. I mean, that would be the implication to me of what's happening there.
Thank you.
Could I stop you there, Mike, because we need to press on to the AGM, but there's just one last comment which has come up from Helen Mackay, who has come up with an interesting reminder that Cocidius is an ancient Celtic name, and its base is found in names all over the Celtic-speaking world. So he was a big Celtic deity, and it's likely he's venerated near the wall because the Romans called on local gods for their protection. So it's really only the carving tradition that's coming north with the Romans, and that's partly what you've been just said, that the deity, the god, the shape, the forms were already existing, and it's the Romans that tipped them into making stone carvings.
Yeah, I think there is debate over whether Cocidius is more widespread. Certainly, Fairless and others think that he's actually very specific. Even what is it, a genus Loki, belonging to a specific place north of Coquetdale, and it's not really anything that I'm in any way qualified to discuss. But yes, my central point is that it's the carving tradition that's coming north, and in some ways it doesn't really matter exactly who that is, whether it's a local god, whether it's a different aspect of the same god that you find further south, whether it's part of a much broader tradition. The key thing here is that it's this idea that for the first time you actually record them in stone in a place where you're going to venerate them, and I think that's the crucial difference, and that's the crucial influence that comes from the Roman world.
Well, Mike, thank you very, very much for this talk, which is incredibly stimulating. And we look forward to hearing you again and meeting you in person when we come on the trip. So thank you very much.